Okay, here's the scene. And like I mentioned, I already have everything set up. And I'm just gonna explain how I did it without necessarily going into much detail. I think it took me about 3 days, maybe 3-4 hours in the evening each day. It definitely, for me, for some reason, it takes much longer than the actual modeling. Just because I'm trying to push the look, always trying to come up with an interesting shader, an interesting map. Again, because there's no UVing, it's not as customizable, so there are a lot of tricks that you go through. So let's talk about the lighting first, because I believe that whenever you're setting up your scene, you should set up the lighting first, choose the HDRI, and then develop the shaders and textures. But ideally, you want to work in a way that no matter what background you choose, and right now, as you can see, I'm using an HDRI. Let me turn this on. I'm using an HDRI, but it's not being used, or it's not going to be used in my final illustration. My final illustration is going to have some other background. So ideally, when you're finalizing the project, you want it to look good both on white background and dark background without the shaders, or without it drastically changing the look. And that's usually the trick. What really helps, and that happens because a lot of how materials look depends on the environment. If I change the environment, it's gonna look much darker or like too blue. So usually it's something neutral, and then I can bring in the adjustments later. What helps is finding a reference image that you're trying to copy. So the first thing that you would copy is the environment, the background, and the HDRI. And then you can start matching the color, start matching the reflectiveness, and like how specular it is or how rough it is in terms of the surfaces. And yeah, you definitely want it to be same both on dark and bright backgrounds. My rule, I tend to go darker usually, so my rule is check it on the white background. So I'm gonna leave it here. In terms of lighting, one more thing that's worth noting is the use of HDRI editor. I mean, everybody knows, if you've been using KeyShot for a little bit, everybody knows that you can use pins. So we will add a pin. It's just going to be a highlight, and oops, it went away. And yes, it's a great tool to make highlights, especially if I change the background to dark. And then I go to HDRI editor just to see where it's highlighting. I'm going to make it red. Just make it brighter. You can see that currently the highlight is right here. You can also click set highlight and just click to the face that you need to be highlighted. It's also pretty useful, especially for separating the object from the background in areas where it's blending with the background in terms of color. But the trick here is that you can create highlights, but you can also darken stuff. If you change the blend mode to alpha and then make this black, you can basically make some areas darker where you need them to be. So for example, right now this overall HDRI is hitting this face of the gun too much. So if I point here, I can make it go a little darker, and this way I can remove the unnecessary highlights. kind of like this. So like this highlight right here, because I'm using it in alpha mode, if I click the highlight, what happens in the HDRI is this area is covering the highlight of the window and it goes away from the image. Now you can I mean, you can change HDRIs, but again, if you pick one in the very beginning, I recommend sticking with it, because once you change it, the look is going to be much different. So for example, it's going to take a second to reload. You can see that some of the, like the plastic and stuff, it was tweaked specifically for that HDRI. So now it looks slightly different. Another way in terms of lighting, another way to add more life to your illustration is using IES lights. Keyshot has some of them by default. If I use some plain geometry and just drop it in real quick. It's still thinking. So I dropped this plane here. I can probably make it smaller. And as long as I have some random piece of geometry, I can turn this geometry into IES light in the material type. IES point light IES profile. And now it's going to be basically a physical light that I can manipulate. IES have a physical shape encoded in there, so they're all different shapes and sizes. They don't depend on the geometry that you're assigning it to. So it doesn't matter if I had a human male base mesh there or a plane, it would still go by the IES profile. And then I can just go right here, and then I can manipulate this highlight. First of all, let's actually change in the material. Let's add multiplier to like 1000. I'm just trying to check what's going on with that light. Let's pick a different IES profile. Okay, there you go. So you can see that in the preview, and you can change that show light sources. You can see this is the round shape that I chose of the IES profile. I can choose an umbrella shape, so it will be different. An umbrella shape has up and down, so it matters. Medium scatter. So I'm basically pointing the light down. And then you can adjust your light, and obviously 53,000 is way too much. Just move that light away. You can see that the benefit of IES highlight is, let me actually move this a little bit. It can act as a spotlight. It's a lot more realistic looking, and it also casts real shadows. Because when you're using HDRI, the shadows are kind of ambient and there are no hard lines for the shadows. So using an IES light is beneficial in terms of getting some interesting shapes. And you can see the material that I'm using for the gun, they only work for that HDRI. And that's okay, they don't have to be real. It's definitely different from real time, so it doesn't matter. Like the material I was using for plastic is really transparent, in fact. And you can see that here. But if you decided to choose to use IES lights here, you would have to change the material for the handle and for all that plastic. And the last thing where the IES is useful is for creating glowing from the inside, where a regular light is not enough and you want some more realistic subsurface scattering and stuff like that. So like for example, if this was skin, it would be, you would just place a light right behind the object in relation to the viewer, to the camera, and you can see that it has a lot of stuff happening here. So definitely useful, but again, changes a lot in the way that your materials look because you develop materials to the HDRI. Let's take a pause right here, and in the next part we will talk about how I developed the shaders and textures.